return to school, and other things that I couldn't concentrate on. I just finished baking my batch of Flotsam Florentines for the evening, and had put off taking my medication just short of being long enough to expect a very insistent Carlisle hunting me down. I kicked myself for putting this task in his care. I could have handled dispensing my own medication, but I wanted to make him feel as involved as possible. Now I was regretting my decision as I inhaled a stealing breath and entered the room. Edward sat across from him in the corner designated for chess, and was chuckling, in a better mood since my fit of inappropriate laughter had melted the tension at dinner. His back was to me, his elbows resting on his knees, as he assessed his chess pieces. Carlisle was leaning back with a grin, and had just opened his mouth to say something, when his gaze met mine.
"Bella,"
he exclaimed in greeting, his eyebrow curving upwards.
"I was expecting you hours ago."
His subtle chide wasn't lost on me as Edward pivoted to meet my gaze, his eyes and grin both widening in surprise at my sudden appearance. Of course, to him it would seem sudden. Carlisle's head bobbed casually toward the desk.
"It's waiting,"
was all he said, as he intended to continue his game. I attempted to shut down my annoyance with his laid-back reference to the little cup sitting on his desk. He had no idea the questions and answers that would follow between Edward and me. I wrung my hands, pulling at the ends of my sleeves as Edward's gaze wandered to the cup in confusion. I briefly pondered the consequences of asking him to leave. Carlisle would grant me privacy without question or hesitation, I was certain. But even though I realized this, I also knew that I was finished hiding things for the sake of avoiding conflict. Better to get it over with now. I unflinchingly walked to the desk, feeling Edward's puzzled stare on me the entire way. I quickly snatched up the cup, lifting it to my mouth, and downing the 2 pills inside. I swallowed with a bottle of water that waited at its side, and turned. Edward's face was blank, lips parted, as he stared at the empty cup and water. He just opened his mouth when I swiftly interjected. "Tired?" I asked, my voice far too buoyant to not arouse suspicions. Carlisle narrowed his eyes at me, tugging at his earlobe, and glancing at Edward, whose eyes never left the desk. He tilted his head, a curious crease formed between his eyes. "I'm tired, you?" I repeated. Edward slowly met my gaze and nodded, turning to Carlisle with a blanched face. I shifted my gaze away as he and Carlisle said, "Good night," feeling intrusive, but too paranoid to risk leaving them alone. I followed him out the door with my head down, already feeling the panic of the coming confession, and the results of doing so after the 3rd stare. His hand brushed mine, interlacing with my fingers, and staring at me.
"What was that?"
he finally asked, halting his steps at the top of stairs and turning to me with worried eyes. Drawing it out like a moron, I asked, "What was what?" I stood for a moment before him, holding his hand and sweeping his face with my eyes. His lips had the slightest part and were moist, full, and inviting. I couldn't remember such a sudden desire to kiss him in the entire 10 months we'd known each other. I trained my eyes on the fine creases of pink and longed to wrap my fingers around his neck, drawing him in, and touching my lips to his. What if this was my last chance? Even if I never told him about therapy, I knew better than to think he'd ever allow himself to be physical with me again after that day. What would we even have left? Maybe just a kiss. I dipped my face in consideration, inclining my body to his unconsciously as I dragged my tongue across my bottom lip. His brisk intake of air disrupted my moment of idiocy. I stiffened and quickly turned, walking until we reached the room. I should have learned by now what throwing myself at him would accomplish. I felt his stare following me as I opened the drawer to the dresser, having already replaced all of his clothing earlier in the evening. Turning to him, I made a show of illustrating this, and evaded. "I keep all my clothes in the guest room. Doesn't make sense to have an empty dresser," and shoved it close with my hip. His lips pursed as he leaned against the door jamb, staring down at his feet.
"You're taking medicine,"
he stated, peeking at me through his lashes and hair. feeling my heart sink and thrash simultaneously. I nodded without elaboration and prepared to stand my ground. I really wanted to be proud of myself for progressing in therapy, not ashamed or frightened. I wanted to be able to share it with Edward because he had been my best friend, and that's what best friends were for. But I was an idiot because his face was taut and hardened. As he gazed at me, his nostrils flared, and his jaw locked, his fists clenching at his sides.
It's okay if it's private.
He ground, teeth clenched as I swallowed nervously.
But if you're sick, please tell me. Edward's point of view. I had to be the unluckiest motherfucker on the face of the planet. Everything was going so good. Too good. Too good to be true. I really should have known. Esme wasn't being a total bitch. Alice hadn't threatened the welfare of my testicles, and Jasper had understood despite my outing him to Alice. He'd even promised to come over and hang out in the evenings. Carlisle had crafted a plan to get me back into school with hopes that I wouldn't be held back a year for my absence. He was happy to have me home, and had already arranged care for my mother. He didn't give me any details. I didn't want any. Things between us were becoming easy, and we could talk freely now, without any bullshit coming between us. It was a good day. The first good day I'd had since I could remember. And, LOL, we'd had a whole night of sleep, an entire day just sitting on the bed, and being close, and shit was getting better. She'd all but told me that she loved me this morning, and she hadn't told Esme that birth control was completely unnecessary. I wasn't happy by the prospect of her needing it, or anything. It just meant that she wasn't jumping to deny that we were intimate. If she'd had no desire to be with me whatsoever, she would have said so. I had so much hope in that moment that it almost eclipsed my total humiliation. Not to even mention, she'd come so fucking close to kissing me back there. I felt it. And now this. So goddamn typical. She held her clothing in her hands, my clothing, and her jaw kind of dropped a bit as she gaped at me. I kept my rigid posture, bracing for reality to finally come and crush me like I knew it would. She shook her head.
I'm not. Well, not technically sick, just...
Paused, and walked to the sofa, lowering herself to the leather, and folding her legs beneath her. Her eyes darted to the space at her side, guarded and wary, and I pushed off the wall, answering her silent request with trepidation. I'd had more than enough of this suspenseful bullshit for one lifetime. Just spit it out, Bella, I pleaded as I sank into the leather at her side. So many circumstances were going through my head, making my worry bloom into a full-on panic. She ducked her chin, shielding her face from me as her fingers fidgeted restlessly with her sleeves. I knew that gesture well enough by now to know that she was really fucking troubled.
I'm scared,
she eventually admitted, peeking at me through the veil of her hair. Few things scared Bella. My breaths began coming in sharp gasps as I foolishly ran through the possibilities of various life-threatening illnesses. Cancer, blood disorders, organ failure, bone degeneration. Most were random things I'd seen over the years, all of the patients replaced with Bella, suffering and deteriorating in the hospital bed. Living with Carlisle for so long had made me privy to seeing so many awful things. My scoff sounded strangled as I responded, I'm scared. I didn't honestly know if I could handle it if something was wrong with her. This was supposed to be heaven, not hell. She inhaled a slow breath and pivoted her body toward me, her eyes already glistening and fearful. Her fingers were still pulling at her sleeves, and I swallowed as I fixed my eyes on the trembles of her fidgets.
You'll leave,
she choked, grasping the material tightly. I snapped my eyes to hers, incredulous and a little pissed off. What the fuck would ever make you think something like that? I asked, finally stilling her fingers as I covered her hand with my own, prying them loose and smoothing them out. Tell me, please, I begged as I clung to her hand, searching her eyes frantically. Her jaw and lips trembled, making my panic escalate as she whispered,
that medicine was prescribed by my therapist.
She closed her eyes and held a grimace, loosening her grip on my hand. I blinked as I stared at her stiffened form for many moments. Her brown eyes were frightened and alarmed as she slowly opened them. Still recovering from my shock, I finally asked, so, you're not sick? When she shook her head, slow and measured, I finally allowed myself to be relieved. I pulled her to me and crushed her to my chest, burying my face in her hair. Don't ever fucking do that to me again. Fucking Christ, Bella, you scared the living shit out of me. I tried to calm my voice and panic, while breathing her scent, letting it soothe me.
You're not mad?
She asked into my chest, still rigid in my embrace. I didn't really give a shit if she had boundaries, or what the fuck ever. I was still reeling from the relief of knowing that she wasn't going to die in the very near future. She always made me so goddamn irrational. Burying my nose deeper into her hair, I shook my head truthfully, knowing that we'd have to discuss it, but feeling too exhausted now to expend the necessary energy. I kissed her on the head as I pulled away, wishing that we could skip past all this shit, and just be happy, like at dinner, when she'd left. Her eyes were still cautious and puzzled, as she disappeared into the bathroom to get ready for bed. I followed, having already unpacked my pajamas, and barely took the time to brush my teeth before I was exiting the bathroom. Neither of us moved to close door, as we climbed under the covers, greedily embracing each other in our familiar pose. I clung to her softness and warmth, longing to have every particle and piece of clothing between us just vanish. I wanted to feel her heat and pulse against my skin, as a constant reminder that my mother's words were just a fictitious, passing possibility, and I would never have to live her sorrow. Bella's soft hum had me asleep within minutes, the soft light spilling over us from the hallway a comfort rather than a hindrance. Saturday was my day, but Sunday was Bella's. She was sitting next to me on the leather sofa as she nibbled on her sandwich. I had shamelessly inhaled mine like a motherfucking Neanderthal. How she wasn't completely repulsed by me was beyond my understanding, but there she was, all fucking smiles and subtle movements. To get closer to me, I inwardly rolled my eyes at her failed stealth, just willing her to stop being so fucking apprehensive. When I'd awoken to yet another over-the-top meal waiting for me, I was a little annoyed. She couldn't possibly do this shit every morning. Sheepishly, she'd admitted that she'd been hungry, and simply didn't like the idea of making food for only herself. Skeptical yet pleased that she'd made an effort to fulfill my request from the previous morning, I'd eventually joined her on the sofa to eat.
Yoga is the worst,
she continued with a sour expression that made me chuckle lazily. She had been explaining her schedule to me for the last hour. Before that, she'd explained therapy and her medication in more detail. Our 13 hours of sleep had made her eager and uncharacteristically open. Or maybe it had just been her freeing honesty from dinner the previous night, I wasn't sure. She tried to get more discussion out of me about Chicago, but I wanted to spend a day without having to think or talk about it. It was so fucking emotionally exhausting. After I told her this, I asked her to tell me about her summer instead. And therapy, of course. I wasn't thrilled about the concept of Ella divulging everything about us to a complete stranger. It made me uneasy and wary when she'd admitted that I'd come up on more than one occasion. I also wasn't thrilled about the idea of her boxing with someone that could knock her pretty little teeth out. But I sucked that shit up and plastered on a smile, because what I was thrilled about was the glimmer of accomplishment and pride in her eyes when she spoke of it. I kept telling myself that was all that mattered. Yoga. I pursed my lips and flung my hair out of my eyes. Isn't that where you get all flexible and shit, with the weird names, like humping zebra, or something? I asked, grinning. Her trilling giggle was like a breath of fresh air, and I reveled in it unabashedly, as she threw her head back, and snorted.
Pretty much.
She nodded with a wry smile.
It came highly recommended by Carmen, though, so.
Though she trailed off with a shrug, sighing. This Carmen woman had come up more in the last 2 hours than as me and Alice combined. I felt envious that this stranger probably knew more about her than I did anymore. I glimpsed at Bella's creeping proximity, and sighed, exasperated with her timid bullshit. Without much thought, I moved closer, her eyes guarded, as our sides met. I probably should have been a little more careful as I sank deeper, but I eventually decided, fuck it, and just rested my head on her shoulder. I yawned, slapping the hair out of my eyes, and was secretly grateful that Esme had been insistent on getting it cut. She turned her head a bit, looking down at me as she slowly relaxed into the suddenness of my proximity. We We sat in silence like that for a long time. I picked up her hand and traced the lines of her palm with my finger like she'd done for me the day before, just generally enjoying the casual touching that we could sometimes